Final speaker for the day, Dr. Inga Carboni. Carboni.
Yeah, not the first name.
Is an assistant professor, right? Okay, associate professor of business at the William and Mary College. She received her PhD in organizational studies from Boston College and studied with Jean. She was at Boston College. And before that, she studied psychology at Baldwin College and received a master's degree in history from Tufts and also a master's degree in social psychology from Boston College. So before joining William and Mary College, she worked as a public television documentary researcher and a writer, market research associate, and a program evaluator for a social network project funded by the U.S. Department of Education. And now she's a social network analysis expert and a consultant. And her areas of research include conflict dynamics, knowledge management, and with a focus on interpersonal and intergroup processes, while examining these relationships from the social network perspective. And her work has appeared in several journals and books, including Human Resource Management, Organizational Research Methods, European Journal for Work in Organizational Psychology, and Group Dynamics, California editor here, and Organizational Network Fieldbook. Welcome.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to present you what was in the paper, but also sort of an extension, even more statistics, and another study that was in there. Although I'm starting to think now there's maybe two papers in there, but I'll let you guys help me figure that out. So this research was done with Tiziana Casero, a colleague of mine, and we wanted to take a look at the performance outcomes for position in positive and negative affective networks. And that's sort of network terms for conflict and getting along, but I'll go into that in a second. So positive affective networks. Social relationships characterized by positive affect, interpersonal liking, friendship. When you say you like someone or you feel close to someone, that's a positive affective relationship. We generally assume that it has, and it often has, a positive association with performance. There have been some mixed results around that, but generally that's the thinking, and the idea comes from a social resource perspective that if you have a positive relationship with someone, you're more likely to help that person, give them access to knowledge, to help, to any other kinds of resources that you have at your disposal, and that maximizes the opportunities for a better performance. So negative affective networks are the opposite. When you dislike someone, really it's relational conflict or affective conflict. When there's tension, a typical question is, who don't you like or don't get along with, or with whom have you had tension or outright conflict? So when I talk about negative affective networks, it's conflict. It's just sort of social network lingo. We do have a pretty robust set of findings that if a lot of people are saying that they have negative affect towards you, you're less likely to do well. And again, that's usually explained from a social resources perspective, where if I don't like you, I don't want to help you. I don't want to give you things. I may even try to prevent you from getting things that would help your performance. For the most part, these have been conceptualized as independent. Actually, for quite a while, they were conceptualized as sort of different ends of a continuum. You either sort of like someone or you dislike them. More recently, and in keeping with work and emotion and affect, it's been pretty determined that there's sort of two separate scales, right? The extent to which you like someone and the extent to which you dislike someone. Because you can always have frenemies, right? And mixed feelings about people. But for the most part, they've been explored independently. There's been a couple of things around organizational commitment and attachment very recently that have looked at the two together, but nothing on performance. So we really don't know empirically what the effects might be if we take a look at your position in both of these networks simultaneously. So are they additive? So if it's a social resources perspective, it sounds like they'd sort of zero out, right? You'd have a lot of people, if you're high in one and low in the other, so if everybody likes you and nobody dislikes you, then you're going to do well, you're going to get a lot of resources. If people dislike you and nobody likes you, then they're going to be preventing you from getting resources. If you're not getting anything, then it's probably kind of neutral. But what about those people who are getting a lot of liking and getting a lot of disliking? People who are well-liked and much hated. Are they going to have neutral? Is it going to neutralize? Are they going to be getting some things from some people and not getting things from other people? Is it additive? Or is there some kind of unusual multiplicative effect of the combination? Okay. So the social resource or social capital perspective is what's usually used to explain these. Another way of looking at it is socially distributed perception. And that is when we think of sort of reputational mechanisms, when we think of what information is communicated by gossip, what you know about a person's position in these networks. Maybe that influences your outcomes. And there's a couple of ways you could do that. So one way it could do that is maybe I want to manage my impressions. And so I think, let's just talk about socially distributed perception in general, how that might influence your access to performance-relevant resources. You may pay attention to the impressions of others, the perceptions that others hold of somebody when you're deciding how to present yourself to that person. If I know everybody loves Erica, then I'm going to want to present myself positively to Erica and give her good things, and resources, and nice things. If everyone feels negatively about her, even though I may not have that personal relationship, I may not want to be seen as giving her positive things. So we rely on the socially distributed information to figure out whether we're going to help or harm or remain neutral to someone. And we also use it maybe to manage our actual impression with this person. And the third way that might influence performance and getting performance-relevant information is, performance evaluations can be somewhat subjective and biased. And maybe a person's position in the set of social relationships sort of serves as a cue for understanding whether they're a good performer or a bad performer. And of course, you pick and select the information that you choose out of the environment, and you do it accordingly. All right, so what does that have to do with these individuals who are high in both positive and high in negative networks? That is very central in these networks. I have a lot of people nominating them positively or negatively. I didn't get a chance to go over this. My computer died, so I don't know what I have on there and what I have said. Okay. So understanding socially distributed perception and how that might influence outcomes may be particularly relevant for highly central people. And these are people who get a lot of nominations. So I was thinking about this problem, and I was talking to a couple people earlier, and I have been working a lot with developmental psychologists lately and going into their literature. And I came up with this very old, but it's actually a very well established and very common way of classifying adolescents and children in the developmental literature. And that's looking at these two poles of whether you're liked and whether you're disliked. And it creates a typology. And this has gone back for quite a ways. You can see that original thing is adapted more than 30 years old. And what they call is the people, as you would suspect, who are well-liked and not disliked are popular. The people who are not liked and are disliked are what they call rejecteds. These are the people we think of as being very central in negative networks. There's these over here, the neglecteds, that nobody likes and nobody particularly dislikes. They're kind of wallpaper. I've done some work on ostracism, so these are people who are actually the sad part is we ask people to identify who you know, and it's not like they don't even have feelings about this person, they don't even realize that the person exists. They're far less likely even to be aware that these people exist. So anyhow. But here is the interesting quadrant, right? The controversials. The ones who are both well-liked and disliked. And my guess is, if you think a little, you can think of a lot of people in your life who are well-liked and much disliked. But we'll turn to the adolescent literature and see what that might tell us about these controversials. We know a couple of things about them. We know that they display superior social leadership skills. They're very much like the populars in that sense. They may even be more socially engaged than their popular peers. Their friends tend to be both popular and disliked people. It's not like they tend to have everybody have these sort of positive and negative feelings. They're low in shyness, high in need for social dominance, disruptive, assertive, anti-authority, admired, risk-taking, and among youth, cool. And so you get this picture of this is the controversial, right? And if you remember, he hangs out with one of the most popular kids and an incredibly ostracized kid. I mean, that's sort of the movie, right? So controversials are kind of cool. So they're kind of cool. But within adolescent research and within children research, there's really not a link with performance. And the tentative links have been very mixed. So I wanted to see if some of this might translate into more of an organizational context. These people who are liked and disliked, who seem to be at the center of positive and conflictual feelings. So I'm going to argue these are, one of the things that's important about these controversials is that they are very visible. Right? They are very visible. Everybody knows who they are. They are much liked and much disliked. Even as opposed to the very popular or the rejecteds, they are the most visible. In fact, there are, in the sociometric developmental literature, the axes are also sometimes tilted from visible and invisible, and that being another dimension, one that we don't consider as much in organizational stuff. We look at popularity, but not as much visibility. It's not completely. Yeah. So what we expect would happen to controversials. We might expect that because of socially distributed perception, they have decreased time on task. Actually, let me step back. If we're thinking about making predictions about performance, about people in those various quadrants, I think it would be easy from a socially distributed perception argument and a social resources argument to say the populars are going to do really well. I think it's also easy to say that the rejecteds and probably are going to do poorly. The neglecteds might do somewhere in between. Not so clear where the controversials will be. So let's take a look at how socially distributed perception might influence their outcomes. So one is they may have decreased time on task. They're going to have to spend a lot of time managing their relationships. And think about it in terms of faculty members. Right? There are some faculty members that cause maelstroms wherever they go. There's some faculty members that nobody wants to work with, so they never get on committees. Nobody wants to work with them, so they're never asked to be on committees. Right? They're off in a corner, they get to do their own work, and in our world, right, their work is actually rewarded because they're off in a corner doing their research while the other people are getting onto committees. If you're a controversial, there are people who want you on those committees. They bring you into the social fabric. But then there are people who don't want you in there. So you're going to spend a lot of time dealing with the social relationships around you and trying to manage those tensions. You're also going to have to do a lot more complex social information processing. Right? So unlike a popular, who can pretty much count on getting good things through people and help, honest, authentic help. And unlike a rejected who doesn't count on anybody because in their experience people are just not going to give them anything anyhow. And the neglecteds, the poor little neglecteds, nobody pays attention and they're just sort of used to that. But the controversials have to do a lot of information processing. is this person giving me genuine help and giving me all the genuine help they can, or are they being influenced by somebody else and maybe withholding or giving me even harmful information? You got to sort of think all this kind of stuff out when you're controversial. So you need to evaluate the value of your social connections in a way that populars and rejecteds and neglecteds don't need to. And you're also putting a lot of relational demands on your coworkers, and this is probably where it will ring familiar for a lot of people. Do you stick your neck out for this friend of yours who is always, the bull in the china shop, who is always causing the problem? So as a peer, it's really hard. Do I help my friend when I know that this person who's very influential, hates her, and so if I help her, how's that going to work for me? And should I risk this? And I'm sure some of my best friends are controversials, but I see what they go through all the time. People have to manage. Am I going to risk my neck? Am I going to put myself on the line for them? So it's very difficult, and this reinforces the complexity for the controversials of decoding what they're getting, because they're in this complicated web of relationships. And not only on their, this relational complexity for others triggers social risk, but it's also troublesome for their managers. All right, they need to spend a lot of time managing people of these controversials and the ripples that they're creating throughout the organization. All right, so they're much, because unlike rejecteds who tend to be outside the social fabric, these controversials are right in the middle of it. As a manager, you're going to spend a lot more time dealing with the repercussions of a controversial's life. All right, so managers have time and effort. Okay. Let's go through this part quickly. We did a convenience sample of some managers trying to test some ideas, and it's in the paper. We basically got some reinforcement from the ways we were thinking. Okay, let me just, all right. So the first study we did was we wanted to test these ideas, and we went into a national service organization. As a 10-month tenure, it had a lot of advantages in that everybody starts on the same day, not knowing each other. Everybody ends on the same day, so it's at least you don't have to deal too much with prior relationships and personal history and stuff like that. We asked everybody to choose, I think, up to 7. I can't remember if it was up to 7 or 10 people that they felt close to in the organization. We found out that if we didn't limit it, it's a very, it's a nonprofit, warm and fuzzy organization, and if we didn't limit it, the pilot testing showed that we'd get some people who just said, I love everybody. So we limited it, and then we asked them of the people that they felt close to, how close did they feel to them. We then also asked them to do the same with the conflictual relationships. Is there anybody who, I have the word, I don't think I took it up. Is there anyone with whom you've had conflict, tension, or you just don't like? That was the question, and they could pick 3 to 5, I think, up to 3 or 5. Many people picked 0 of those. We also had performance data for all the individuals, and these were from their supervisors, and it was a nice scale, a good alpha, and that's a pretty reliable one on quality of their performance. Okay. So, we did multi-level modeling. These people were nested in teams. We did the same kind of analysis with them nested in supervisors. The results were essentially the same. And controlling for a couple of things. This was actually an incredibly diverse group. It's one of the reasons that I wanted to work with them. They had about 50% who were people of color. There was a pretty 50-50 gender split. There was lots of changes around education. The one thing they were pretty homogenous on was that they were, I think, 19 to 25, so they're a fairly young group, right? But the important statistic here is this last one that shows that there is an interaction and it's significant. And when you plot it, you can see that this is the top quartile of positive centrality, and this is the high. These are the controversials. They're right here. And in this particular data set, people who had more than 4 positive nominations and were 4 negative nominations did the worst. So we wanted to dig into it a little bit. We wanted to see if it's that they were being liked by the disliked people, they were being liked by the rejecteds and hated by the populars, which would sort of reinforce that they're actually sort of the king of the unpopulars or the king of the rejecteds. And we did a bunch of chi-squares, and that doesn't show us that that's happening here. These left-hand ones are people making nominations. Here are the people receiving nominations. Just did median splits. Also did it with quartiles, same kind of thing. And you find that these bold ones, they're not significantly different given the pattern of nominations. So it's not that populars hate them and rejecteds love them. They're getting it pretty equally from everywhere. So there's no sort of, there's not the alternative explanation that they are just, the kings of the rejecteds. We also, who was this? I split them into high performers, low performers. I think those are median splits. I also did quartiles. There was no difference in the positive affective network, so that were the low performers the ones that were being the controversials. And somebody loved the slackers, and some people hated the slackers. Found no evidence of that in the positive affective networks. Some evidence of that, weak evidence of that, the P's 0.07 in the negative affective networks. So, maybe that dynamic was contributing to it, but it certainly wasn't a significant effect. We also took a look at their conflict handling styles. We used Rhimes' inventory, conflict handling inventory. I did this a bunch of ways, and one way I did it was to factor analyze it, and so that which kind of reinforces this finding. Basically, what I was kind of hoping is that these are the, part of it was their dominating conflict handling style, and I didn't find that. I kind of hoped to find that, but what I did find was that they were less likely to use, what might be considered relationally, or which are relationally oriented styles. So they were less likely to use an integrative approach. They're less likely to use an obliging approach, and this is a trending here. They were somewhat less likely to use compromising, but definitely less likely to use approaches that were high in relational considerations. So maybe something that's going on is their style. They're just going to say what they say, and they don't care what you think. And maybe we're trying to figure out who these controversials are, not just where they're located, but who they are. And it sounded like maybe it has something to do with the way they manage conflict. We replicated this. I'll go through this really quickly. Obviously, some of the possible limitations in the first set is that it's a soft, squishy nonprofit. Maybe there are just very subjective evaluations, and they were pretty young, and it was kind of homogenous, and maybe that's just a funky data set. So we went into a high-tech sales firm. We looked at teams, and we had actually selected high-performing and low-performing teams. So we were looking at teams specifically with that pre-identified in that way. And in this case, individual performance was their final year-end rating, and it was pretty much based on their sales quota. So it was a pretty objective measure of performance in this case. These were a very homogeneous group, much older, varying levels of tenure, varying levels of any kind of the demographics you would expect in a larger organization. We collapsed the 4-point scale into 3 categories. Whatever, didn't matter. And so here is our final result. This is, again, multi-level modeling. In this case, we're looking at a dichotomous outcome, or actually a categorical three-level outcome. So it's strange that it's positive, but you're actually sort of predicting the opposite. If you map this out, this is, again, what you see. You see the very well-liked people who are also much disliked, these controversials. Again, they underperform everyone else. So what we think that this might contribute is, first of all, we looked at the interactive effects. We think we're one of the first studies that looked at that in relation to performance. We brought to theoretical consideration just this social visibility has been looked at before in organizations, but I think hopefully what some of you are taking away from this study is that it may actually be much more relevant and much more central, certainly to the studies here and studies of position in positive and negative affective networks than we might be previously understanding. I also think it helps to shift the emphasis of perspective taking and perception of other from a dyadic perspective, which it often is, to a more distributive, socially distributive perspective. And that's becoming, you're seeing a couple of studies now in social networks that do that. They look at gossip and reputation as they spread through networks and things. Obviously there's some limitations, I won't go into those, but we also like the idea of introducing this concept of the controversials and looking at a lot of the work that's already been done in developmental work and in developmental literature. And in some ways, looking at controversials in this way raises almost as many questions as, who are they? Where did they come from? How did they get to this position? What are they doing that is getting some of these outcomes? And we've posited that it's maybe somewhat due to their conflict handling method. And we've posited a social perception, a distributed social perception mechanism, but I think there's lots more questions and things to be answered there. Go ahead.
They sound a lot like narcissists. An individual who is high in narcissism is going to bring attention to oneself, for better or worse, self-promote, take a strong stance on things, have a domineering and non-obligated, non-reciprocal relationship. Sounds to me like everything you've described is over grandiose narcissism.
They could be. They could be. They could be. That would be really interesting. We don't have the only research that I know of that's been done in social networks connecting it to narcissism finds that they generally believe that they are much more liked than they actually are. But I don't know of any research that locates them as being high in liking and being well liked and being greatly disliked. In fact, I would think they'd be more likely to be disliked, unless you're snowed by the narcissist.
It depends on how long they've known the narcissist.
That short-term organization, they don't
in the
have
short
time
term,
to be disliked.
Yeah, that could be true in the short term. The measurements were taken when they were about 6 months in. They worked very intensively together in teams. It's a little less likely to be the case in the other one, because for some cases, but that's maybe that personality factor is what put them in that position.
I also have another quick question. Is it possible, and I don't know how statistically to do this, but is it possible that there's also a curvilinear relationship? Because if somebody's too agreeable, everybody likes the person, that means they never say anything that goes against the group. They never say anything that would ruffle a feather or be controversial. And my advisor always told me that if there isn't at least one person in literature that hates you, you're not doing your job.
Yes.
So
I know where you're going. I think I know where you're going with this.
Yeah.
And this idea is that you're not a real leader unless you're cracking a few eggs, right? You're not really making omelets unless you're cracking some eggs. And I agree with you. And we certainly found that being well-liked and having a couple of people dislike you was not a detriment. That was not a detriment. It was when you got a significant number of people. In the first case, I don't have the raw data numbers. It's in a longer paper than the second one. But in the first case, if you had 4 people disliking you and 4 people liking you, so it's fairly significant. It's not just 1 or 2. Then you started seeing the effects. So it isn't that you're only liked and not disliked. It's that it's a preponderance of liking versus disliking.
Yeah, building off those last couple questions, I would predict populars, some of the populars, wouldn't be central hubs in your organizations for the reasons. Well, I find this in my own data. I'm an anthropologist and I work in small-scale societies. That the people that are central hubs of the networks I look at, the social alliances and the conflicts, they tend to be the same individuals. You could call them the controversials. And that's particularly true of denser networks. So larger villages, denser connections, I see people, the same people that are hubs of the alliance networks tend to be hubs of the conflict networks. And you know, like you suggested, if you're taking on leadership roles, including helping to manage conflicts, diffuse conflicts, you're bound to upset some people. And so that just comes with the territory. And some of my current work is on personality. You suggested narcissism. I sort of see personality in part as something like extroversion as sort of a strategy that motivates seeking and maintaining these kinds of central hubs in social networks or leadership positions. And that strategy arises in part based on other characteristics, the calibrating personality, like your body size, your knowledge, your existing social connections, such that when you get to these central positions, you're better able to take advantage of opportunities and offer these costs of upsetting people.
You know, I see where you're coming from, and I see how it's an extension of what Dan was saying. But what we're finding, and that's why certainly more researches need to be done on controversials. I suspect there are more than one type of controversials. Maybe there's the kind who's, you know, heavy-handed but working for the organization, and the slackers hate them, and that, you know, it's not what we found here, but it, you know, could be like that. But what you're saying would suggest the person would get the highest performance rating, right? And that's exactly the opposite of what we found.
Not necessarily the highest performance rating, but would be sort of the sort of central hub of the organizational network.
Which is by definition what they are. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, it's a little bit of a counterintuitive problem finding for these controversials to score the lowest. On the other hand, when you think about all the relational demands they put on their peers and they put on their managers, you can see why they may be getting, you know, less resources and counting on getting the resources, you know. And they also are having their time taken up. Those rejecteds, I think a lot about the faculty, right? So the ones that nobody wants to work with, who are just, you know, a pain, they can go off in their office and they just write their papers, right? And the rest of us, you know, who are like, I will get on this committee, get you on that, get you doing this, get you doing that, and then all my time is taken off the task that is actually most highly awarded, right?
I was wondering if you had thought about considering, is there kind of another moderator, right? So if you're controversial, is that worse if you're a woman than a man, right? Or is it worse if you have low power than high power, right? So if you're high, you can be the CEO, everybody can hate you, and you know, a lot of people can hate you and like you, but it's okay because you have enough power to, you know, just get rid of the people who don't like you too much.
I have looked at the effects for genders and related to the brokerage position for women, and that does tend to be the response that they get is a negative thing. In this particular data set, that wasn't the case. And I don't know if I made it clear, but in the first study, it was very flat organization. Some people had been there for 2 years, but that didn't seem to affect anything. And the second organization was also fairly flat, but we tried to control for tenure and all that kind of stuff. But I would not be surprised. We didn't find it in this data set. I have found it with a different network position where you're a broker in positive networks and you get negative, you attract negative things subsequent to occupying that position. And that happens for women, but not for men.
So interesting, because you talk about when this emerges sort of from work history and personal history. How do you connect that back to the adolescent work, or a very different developmental point in their lives? How did this develop? Because it must have developed in early adolescence or earlier.
Well, I'll tell you, there hasn't been a lot of network stuff done using that model in the way that I've looked at network stuff. There's a lot of stuff within classrooms that have been done. Young kids, who would you say is popular, which is a different question that I was asking here. In the developmental world, a lot of researchers shy away from asking people who do you dislike. You have to have a really great relationship with the school to be able to ask, you know, the kids, who do you dislike? And actually, I was lucky enough to get that data from, and in that data set among adolescents, girls really suffer from having a particular, these brokers just have a terrible time of it. They experience themselves as being on the edge of stuff. We know from other stuff that they're more likely to commit suicide, a suicide ideation, whereas for men, they're more likely to be given leadership attributions. And it seems to me that follows them into management. Well, the adolescent lecture, some people say they're high in social dominance, which kind of fits with the conflict handling kind of thing, and that's how they get to come there. I can tell you that I've done longitudinal studies on adolescents, on youth, youth up to 25, so this kind of data set. And it's very consistent who gets positive and who gets negative nominations, although the source changes. Incredible turnover, especially among negative networks. But the same people get the high negative things over time. So they're clearly doing something that attracts negative things. And maybe it's coming on heavy-handed. I mean, my controversial friends are very passionate and have strong beliefs and take strong stands. And I love that about them. But they piss a lot of people off, by doing that.
So a follow-up question to that is, I wonder if controversial is a compound construct, and if it is, what are the fundamental building blocks of that? Like you mentioned passion, you mentioned, attention to task. And so I wonder if there's any way that you're really looking at as a factor, that there are individual things that would create that are in fact very interesting together.
I totally agree with you. I can't explore that so well in these data sets, but I do have adolescent network data sets, and I have them longitudinally, and they're massive, and I have several of them. So I can explore it in there, which would be really neat, because I suspect there are subtypes as well. Did you have
I think I know some controversial, so this is really fascinating. When you first started talking about liking and disliking being independent, and I wonder if that can be true within raters as well as between raters. That is, it seems to me that the controversial sometimes I like them and I hate them.
Yeah.
They just there's much there to respond to with them, and I just wanted to get your thought about that.
I have, and in this data set, people were free to choose the same people as liking and disliking, and I didn't get anybody doing that in these two data sets. In my adolescent data sets, I've done 3 different schools, 4 time points. Each school was several hundred kids, and there was the same kids over time, so whatever, a couple thousand time points. I only, in that data set, found a total of, it's about a dozen people who had who looked like they legitimately had received a positive and a negative thing from the same person. And I don't know, maybe could be dating them or something like that. Who knows, right? I actually was presenting this a while ago, and somebody was saying, like, well, what about those people who are really popular, but everybody hates them, and the mean girls, who are really popular and stuff. But I didn't ask people who you thought was popular. I asked people, I'm calling that popular, but I didn't ask them. I have a 6-year-old. Yeah, she's 6. I have a 6-year-old, and she came home from kindergarten and sort of very matter-of-factly told me that, Taylor Ann was the most popular girl in class. And I said, oh, how do you know? And she was like, well, all the boys, chase after her, and most people tend to honor and respect her. And I said, oh, where are you? And she said, I'm probably 3rd most popular. Elizabeth might be. Yeah, I'm probably 3rd most popular. And kids are so clear on where you are in the pecking order. So popularity is a different question than liking and disliking. That's how I feel versus everybody knows that she's the most popular and that he's the least popular. So, but I found very few cases of friendlies in my data. Any other questions? Thank you.
How are we doing on time? We're doing fine on time. Stretch your legs. We're going to dinner at 5 o'clock? All right, 5 o'clock. Okay, 5 minutes.
Your data would suggest that the meta-analysis you did, that the narcissist do when they're, so.
Eventually.
Over time. Right. As they move up.
6 months.
Yeah, I think so. So maybe it's something else going on where there's a lack of, there's that leadership authoritative quality of the narcissism. Maybe there's a Yeah, no, I absolutely am fascinated by this. So the idea that, because narcissism is a multifaceted trait, and the thing that really makes them aversive to other people is their entitlement and their exploitative nature. Right. Now, if you subtract that, but you're still looking at the other two facets of being grandiose and being a leader authoritative, that may be people that are already stepping into the middle of a controversy, making their voices heard, accepting the fact that people dislike them, but they're not necessarily, as you say, dislikable